Good morning, Morai Rabotai. We are continuing on Mesechet Avodah Zarah, and we are on top of the Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, starting again from the Mishnah. The second line, today's Amud is being learned. L'schud refuah shelema, Avrachel Simcha Bad Nahid, Shahram, Shalom Ben Turan, Yasamin Bat Sarah, Toch Sha'ar Chole Yisrael, that you have refuah shelema. Amen. We started the Mishnah, we're going to start it over again. Short Mishnah, talking about Tarovet of Yain Nesech. What happens when you have some Yain Nesech getting mixed with regular wine or water, any other drink that it may be, says the Mishnah, Yain Nesech Asur, ve'oser b'mashu, b'chol shu. Yain Nesech is Asur, Asur ba'na'a, and when it gets mixed, it asers up, it prohibits the tarovet, the mixture b'mashu, with a little bit even, it's going to be asur. The entire mix is going to be asur. Yayin beyayin, if wine that's yayin nesech gets mixed with wine that's good, kosher wine, and mayim b'mayim, if mayim nesech, that means just like in Chag HaSukkot they would do nisuch hamayim in Bet HaMikdash, if lahavdil, the Avodah Zarah also poured wine in the honor of the Avodah Zarah. That's Mayim Nesech. It's also Avodah Zarah, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily wine. Anything that's their minhag to do for Avodah Zarah, it will become also the same level of Isur for Avodah Zarah. So therefore, if you have Mayim beMayim, water that is Nesech with a regular kosher water, Bechol Shu, it's also Asur Bechol Shu. But if you have now crisscross, basically you have Mayim Beyayin or Yayin Bemayim, says the Mishnah, in those cases, Benoten Tam. It's only when you have the taste of wine still there, that's when it's going to be Asur. If the taste of the Isur is making a difference, then it's asur. If the taste of the isur is not making any dent, any difference, then it's going to be mutar. So says the Gemara, ze aklal. The rule of thumb is, when you have min bemino b'mashu, when you have something of isur mixing with its own kind, that the tastes are the same, then even b'mashu, even a little bit, because there's no distinction of taste, you have some isur over here, and therefore even a minute amount is going to prohibit the entire mix. But when you have shelo b'mino, when you have min b'she'eno mino, two different types, two different tastes, then it's going to be nullifiable, so to speak, with pouring more of heter and nullifying the taste of isur, and there would be benot and tam. Now, says the Gemara, we're going to go through number of variations of what Rabbi Yochanan really held when it comes to this halacha. We know that Rabbi Yochanan is extremely important because even Rav and Shmuel together versus Rabbi Yochanan, halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is very much halachic opinion. So the Gemara is going to go through at least three different versions of what Rabbi Yochanan exactly said when it comes to the tarovet of min b'mino versus min b'she'eno mino. So says the Gemara, Ki ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ha'me'arei yain nesech michavit lebor. If you have yain nesech and you start pouring it into the vat of wine, so what happens is you have kosher wine on the bottom, yain nesech on the top, and you're mixing the yain nesech with the regular kosher wine. Afilu kol hayom kulo rishon batil. Even if you're standing there pouring yain nesech the entire day, the whole mix is mutar. Why? Because every drop of yain nesech that falls into the vat is going to become mutar immediately. Kama batil. Every drop falls mutar, falls mutar, right? Because the majority of the wine is yain that's kasher, and every droplet that falls in becomes mutar. Now, we learned the Mishnah. We thought that, well, when you have min bemino, the Mishnah seems to say that when you have min bemino, you pour, yain nesech into kosher wine, and immediately, bekorshehu, even if you have one drop, the whole thing, that's how we learned, right? Rabbi Yochanan says exactly the opposite. You could be standing there the entire day pouring wine, yain nesech into this, that, and at the end of the day, you may even have more yain nesech ending up than original amount of kosher wine, and still the whole thing is mutar. So how does that work? Says the Gemara. Tanan, the Gemara right away asks this question. So basically, how can Rabbi Yochanan say this? Rabbi Yochanan is a tremendous Amorah, but at the end of the day, he's an Amorah. The Mishnah seems not to say like that. The Mishnah seems to indicate that when you have a mixture of a little bit of yain nesech with a lot of yain kasher, the entire mix becomes asur. Tenan, we learned in Mesechet Avodah Zarah, in Gimel Amud Aleph on the top of the Amud, yain nesech asur ve'oser bechorshu. Our Mishnah. My love, the kanafal isura legohetera. Why don't we learn our Mishnah in a scenario of Rabbi Yochanan that yain of isur, yain nesech, is falling into a kosher wine, which is the case of Rabbi Yochanan? Why wouldn't the Mishnah be that very case? Because the Mishnah does not differentiate what got mixed with what. The Mishnah just says, min bemino, if you have the same min, the same type of wine, yayin beyayin, is asur bekorshehu. So it should be covering the case of Rabbi Yochanan as well. As says the Gemara, no. Lo. The karnafil hetera legois. That Mishnah only works when it's the other way around. It is heter that's falling into isur, not isur falling into heter. So says the Gemara, Tashma, come and listen. Yayin b'mayim. Now in other words, we don't have a full proof from our Mishnah or Gemara. Now we have got a problem. We have Rabbi Yochanan. We have the simple understanding of our Mishnah. Now we have to deal with it. The Gemara tries to push back on this Rabbi Yochanan. Tashma, yayin b'mayim benoten tam. Says our Mishnah that yayin inside water is going to be benoten tam. Now, what's the case of yayin pouring into water? My love, de kanafil chamra de isura lemaya de hetera. Why wouldn't we say that this is yayin nesech pouring into regular kosher water? And therefore, you see that yayin of isur falling into kosher water, regular water, would be benoten tam. Says the Gemara, and what would that indicate, by the way? When you have yain nesech falling into kosher water, you need noten tam. In other words, it will be asur unless you have so much water that the yain does not even give a taste to the entire mix. But if you go following the logic of our Rabbi Yochanan, what would be the halacha? The first drop of wine that falls in goes batel. Second drop, batel. Third drop, batel. Even if you poured so much that the whole mixture tastes like wine, still the whole thing should be mutar. So why do you tell me benoten tam at the end? When you tell me benoten tam, it indicates very clearly that it does not, it's not comma batil, as we would say. It's not little by little becoming nullified. Every drop of yain nesech in the water, mutar. Next drop, mutar. Next drop, mutar. We don't say that. Says the Gemara, lo, that's not the case. Who said that we're talking about the case that yain nesech is falling into water? It's the other way around. Look, the kanafir chamra de tera lemaya de isura. It's good kosher wine falling into mayim nesech. That's what's happening. And therefore, every drop that falls in does not become mutar. If anything, should become asur, unless you have the subtotal of the whole thing. It's going to become mutar. So says the Gemara, umideresha b'maya de isura sefa nami b'maya de isura. Why don't you say that the Mishnah should be reading properly in a pattern? You have to have a pattern for the Mishnah. Just like Resha, the beginning of the Mishnah, the beginning of our cases start with Maya de Isura, because remember, it was water of Isur getting mixed with water of Heter. So we should say Sefa also is talking about Maya de Isura falling into wine that's mutar. So who told you? In other words, the Mishnah, the Gemara is now pushing back. He says, you're telling me that we're not talking about the case that asur water is falling into heter wine. You're telling me that we're talking about the reverse case, that mutter wine is falling into asur water, right? Who says? It's not going to be homogeneous. It's not going to be a pattern with the Resha of the Mishnah. Resha of the Mishnah is talking about water of Isur, right? So here also it should be water of Isur falling into Yain of Heter. So the Gemara says, no, that's not the pattern. There's a different pattern. I also have a pattern for what I'm saying. You know what the pattern is? Says the Gemara. Let's go through explaining this first. Sefa nami b'maya de isura. It should be sefa of the Mishnah also talking about water of isur falling into yayin of heter. V'katani sefa mayim beyayin benoten tam. And still you see that mayim beyayin is benoten tam. That water of isur falling into yayin of heter, it should be benoten tam. So you see that you don't go kama batil, because if water of Isur is falling into yain of Eter, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it should be every droplet that falls in becoming mutar. Every droplet of prohibited water that hits the kosher wine should become mutar. Mutarim lachem, mutarim lachem, mutarim lachem. Every drop should become mutar, right? So you see that that's not the case. Amar lecha, Rav Dimi would answer. He says, no. You are telling a good thing. Yes, the Mishnayot should have a pattern, but it's not like I don't have a pattern. You know what the pattern of the Mishnah is, according to me? Kula matnitin hetera lego isura. The entire Mishnah has a pattern of heter falling into isur. So Reisha, when he talks about the karnafil chamra de hetera lemaya de isura, Reisha, the beginning of the Mishnah that talks about wine falling into water, it is exactly that. It is the water, the wine that is mutar falling into the water that's asur, right? Reisha de kanafil chamra de etera lemaya de isura, and sefa de kanafil maya de etera lechamra de isura. The common denominator of the entire Mishnah is something mutar is falling into something asur. That's what the common denominator is. That's the pattern of the Mishnah. So don't tell me it has to always be in our Mishnah asur dika water, prohibited water. It has nothing to do with water or wine. It has to do with the pattern of something mutar falling into something asur. That's the pattern. And therefore, says Rav Dimi, I could read the Mishnah just fine the way I did. So that is the shita of Rav Dimi so far. So what does Rav Dimi hold? Before we go to the next piece of Rabbi Yochanan, according to the different shita, Rav Dimi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if you have something asur falling into something, something asur falling into something mutar, kama batil, every little bit is going to be mutar. Therefore, you could have a person standing with a massive container of yain nesech and slowly dripping the yain nesech into a vessel of yain that's kasher, and every drop that hits becomes mutar. The whole day you could be pouring yain nesech into kosher wine, and the entire mix is mutar. Our Mishnah says that yayin that gets mixed with wine is bekol shehu. Says Rabbi Yochanan, I have no problem. Rabbi Yochanan, my Rabbi, doesn't have any problem with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about the case that you're pouring yayin that's kasher into yayin that's asur. But if you're pouring yayin that's asur into yayin that's kasher, every little bit that joins the kosher wine becomes kasher, becomes mutar, becomes batel. And therefore, the Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Dimi, reads very well with our Mishnah. That's the first shita of Rabbi Yochanan. And now we know why it's not necessarily a contradiction with our Mishnah.
Why does it have to be droplets? Why can't it just be...
Not even if it's a small, because you'll see later on, if you just dump the whole thing at once, right? So then it's not going to be a kol shehu, right? You don't have bitul necessarily unless you have the amount of bitul, whatever it's necessary for wine, in the bottom one than the top. So that's why I'm very careful. The Gemara is careful to say that it is happening little by little, because every little becomes mashenkin. If you would just dump a bucket of wine of yain nesech all at once into another bucket of wine, it may not be batel if you don't have enough to nullify the yain nesech. Right?
Not concerned about like a stream that's connected from one container to the other, connecting the two with the stream?
So that's a very good question. That's a very good question. What happens with nisok? Right now, so we did learn right before in Amud Bet, we learned that the maskana of the Gemara seemed to suggest, based on Rav Sheshet, right, that you don't go after nisok necessarily on a darabanan, right? On a doraita level, if you have actual yain nesech, it may be a different story. Actually, the Chelkat Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Mordechai Breish, was asked in a question that was posed to him by a Rav that wanted to be mesader kiddushin for a couple that is not from. Chacham Badia actually was asked this question also in Yebia Omer Chelek Aleph in Yoredah Siman Yud Aleph, a large and amazing tshuva that he authored about the wine that you're pouring for for the Chatan and Kala. Is that become yain nesech? Is it mutar for you? And then you pour more wine in it. All the details of that, and also the goy that pours wine. What happens with so the wine that he poured on the cup is yain nesech, but what happens with the wine that is in the bottle, right? Okay, which is very nogeya to know, because you go to a bar, for instance, at a wedding, and let's imagine that you want to be machmir that the yain mevushal nowadays is not considered mevushal, right? It's got many Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Yashiv, many others were stringent like that. So you have the goy pouring wine. What's the halacha of the wine inside the bottle? Can I just take the bottle myself and pour for myself because the wine is or maybe I can't, because the whole thing has become affected by the goy touching the bottle, right? So that will become actually very nogea, this whole nisok thing. If it's connected with yain nesech, maybe that would be not like Rav Sheshet. In other words, when we learned Rav Sheshet holds that the Rabbanan only made a gezerah on what pours out of the bottle, not what's contained inside of the bottle. Maybe he's only talking about the case that there's no direct connection of nisok between the wine that you poured and the wine in the bottle. But if you have a direct pour, maybe that actually would affect it. So that becomes a question in which, again, Rabbi Yaakov Mordechai Breish is much more machmir, and that Chacham Obadia in that tshuva in Seif Katan Chaf Aleph. It's a long tshuva. In Seif Chaf Aleph of that tshuva, Chacham Obadia actually is much more lenient. He brings Rav Sheshet. He holds that pour does not affect at all the wine inside the bottle. So therefore, there's a lot to talk about. Perhaps there's certainly room to be mekel, and also there's room to be machmir. It's one of those machlokes. Rav Moshe Sternbach has a tshuva on this in Tshuvot v'Hanhagot, and so on and so forth. There's a lot to talk about that in a halachic way. But again, Chacham Ovadia takes the side of those who are more lenient, learning a Gemara that we just had in a lenient way. So that says the Gemara. So that's the first one. Now the second one, says the Gemara, is Ki ata Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Hame'are yain nesech mitzarzur katan lebor afilu kol hayom kulo rishon batel. If you are pouring wine, I didn't realize that we were out of time. I'll try to read this quickly. Says Rabbi Yochanan, according to this Talmud of Rabbi Yitzchak, mentioning the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan, a different Talmud of his, mentioning his Shita, that you pour wine from yain nesech, from a small sarsur, from a small container, to a large vat of wine, it's going to be batel, little by little. So